All right, we still have folks piling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, hello everybody. My name is Robert Hernandez. I'm a solutions architect here at LightEdge, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about disaster recovery in 2025. A couple things right off the top. Who you're talking to today? So I already mentioned myself, Robert Hernandez, solutions architect here at LightEdge. You can already see with me today is Matt Leary. He's also a solutions architect here at LightEdge. Matt, you want to introduce yourself, bud?
Yeah, Matt Leary. Great, happy to be here.
And real quick, we do have some technical difficulties for Mr. Thad. He will join as soon as he is able to. So we're going to go ahead and keep on cruising in the meantime. But Thad is our senior product manager here at LightEdge. He was also a solutions architect at LightEdge for some time. And he's really kind of helping us shape what our product and roadmap looks like from like a backup and disaster recovery perspective. But again, we'll have him join here as soon as he is able. We'll go ahead and keep moving in the meantime. So real quick, couple things we're going over today. So first, DR landscape. So let's just get a good understanding of where things are today, right? And so what I mean by that is, if you attended our previous session talking about multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, right? Things are different now with changes to Broadcom, cloud repatriation. We talk about data sprawl, so many things going on from a DR perspective. So we want to kind of level set and see where things are today. Taking a little bit of time also to define a disaster, like defining actual disaster recovery. I think for so long we had put so much emphasis around like, well, disaster recovery means I can take my VM from one place and move it to another, and that's disaster recovery. Or I have a secondary copy of my data somewhere, and that's not really how that works exactly. So we're going to touch on that a little bit. And then kind of 3 and 4 here really kind of blend into one another in a way, right? So really in terms of discussing like designing what a disaster recovery plan looks like or a business continuity plan looks like. And again, Matt and I have been working in IT for a number of years now. So we have plenty of lessons from the field that kind of, again, help us when we're having these conversations with clients, help us really shape things, right? Like, hey, you're trying to accomplish these goals. We also had to accomplish these goals, and here are the things that we ran into along the way. So we're going to kind of jump back and forth here a little bit. We're going to do our best to keep it fairly conversational as well. Real quick, before we dive in proper, if there are any questions along the way, please, again, don't hesitate, toss them in there. We'll get those answered either along the way or towards the end. Either way works. So going to go ahead and dive right in. We're going to talk a little bit about the DR landscape. And these are just some of the 3 of the bullet points that we had kind of top of mind, right, for a lot of organizations. But there's a lot more to it than that. So I want to kind of just start right off the top with 2 of the big ones, right? Ransomware, which is just never going anywhere, and AI. Okay, so let's just talk for a moment about ransomware and kind of the state of where ransomware is right now. So when we think about I mean, it's seemingly, Matt, there's a website that I follow. It's called Krebs on Security. I'm not sure if you're familiar. So Brian Krebs is like a security consultant, and he does all kinds of investigative pieces on like these massive, goodness gracious, like these state-sponsored hacking groups. He was one of the early on folks that identified. I think it was called Black Basta specifically was that one. Oh, I think we had somebody join us. Is that you?
It is. Can you hear me?
I can hear you indeed. Welcome, sir.
Yes.
All right, we'll go ahead and keep on cruising. Looks like your camera's still catching up, but we'll go ahead and keep cruising. Right now, Thad, we're talking about just kind of the state of like ransomware in 2025, and just in broad terms, right? So back to what I was talking about. I was working with reading an article on Krebs on Security, and it's interesting. There was this discussion about they had phrased it as APTs. For those that are not aware, advanced persistent threats is what that means. But he had coined a new term called advanced persistent teens. And so what that was that teenagers, at least the folks that had been identified, right, were just trying these massive phishing campaigns, just absolutely sending out as many communications, text messages, IMs, as much as they could. And a lot of that was fueled by AI. Because again, one of the things, and actually, Matt, I'll kick this over to you because we've done a ton of these trainings over the years, right? It was so easy for years to be able to pretty quickly identify when an email was phishing, right? You would look at poor grammar. You would look at incorrect spelling is poor grammar, but you would look at kind of the vagueness of it. Like it wasn't really all that good. It was pretty readily identifiable in a lot of cases. And working in school districts, I'm sure you've encountered that plenty as well. So if you don't mind my asking, like what is kind of the biggest challenges that you're seeing when it comes to people just being able to, I guess, fish more effectively, right? Like, I mean, we're having conversations with clients about this even today, right? Like it's difficult to kind of deal with the scale of it all when it all looks so good these days, you know?
Yeah, I think that is a massive problem. Like you were talking about going through the training and everything, being able to spot, bad grammar. No one from this address would send me this email or anything like that. And one of the ways that when I ran, phishing tests for different MSPs that I work for, one of the ways that I would always catch the most people is setting it up to make it look real. Hey, we're doing a fantasy football thing, but it's a fake phishing email. Click this link to sign up or something. Now that they're using this AI generated stuff to pull in more information, make it look way more convincing. It is a lot harder to actually spot unless people do take the time and truly look at the content of what they're clicking on and what they're reading or anything like that. And it's what's going to be the next iteration of spam filtering to catch AI generated messages of was this created by ChatGPT or some kind of AI bot or anything like that, as far as message content goes, or image generation or link generation.
It's crazy right now to think about. Again, it's always just been more of a scale thing, right? It's being able to very, very quickly generate an awful lot of, again, tailored conversations, right? And again, when we look at, actually, you know what? Let me take a step back here for a second, if I may. I think it's important to also kind of call out that despite all the trainings, despite what we've been taught about looking for grammar, checking links, all this stuff, it happens. I have been phished before. I absolutely have. I had this was years ago at this point now, fortunately, but there were some charges on my card that I did not recognize. Come to find out, it actually was something that was legitimate. But at the same time, I happened to get an email saying that my account had been compromised. I think this was my iTunes account. And me, panic, oh goodness, right? My debit card is linked directly to that, all this stuff. Like I clicked the link, I reset my password, and immediately they had everything. And again, it's panic. It's oh goodness, I need to be able to pay for this. I need to be able to watch all this. There's so much kind of happening there too, just from a personal perspective. So it's kind of multi-layered, right? It's not just about technology, it's about kind of that emotional and personal experience. But if I may kind of move a little bit, thinking about ransomware, thinking about kind of the speed with which it is going to be able to be generated and pumped out, right? When I think about AI, I also think about data. One of the things that is often, I feel like, misunderstood about AI and the state that it's in today is that it's truly wholly dependent upon data. It does not matter what tooling or whatever you put in front of it, right? If you have bad data underneath it, it's going to continue to spit out bad data. But that's a different conversation. But in terms of ransomware, in terms of data protection and security, right? Suddenly AI has to have access to a lot of different data sets, right? Suddenly, if I want to use Amazon Bedrock or AWS Bedrock to train my own language models, if I want to use like a ChatGPT or a Copilot, but train it on internal documentation, suddenly I have to have these connections to my enterprise data, which is really, 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 really critical. And so with that in mind, and actually Thad, if I may kind of kick it over to you a little bit, when we talk about kind of data sprawl, when we talk about, hey, I have to be able to use AI in these different places, we took that to heart in terms of like our product design, right? Especially for data protection. We wanted to make sure that, hey, whatever you decide you need to do, whatever product services you lean in on, we're going to be able to kind of help you along the way. Can you talk a little bit about like how the kind of the process for thinking about like data protection here at LightEdge and how we're kind of trying to meet customers where they're at?
Yeah, absolutely. Robert, I think it's critical for us as a service provider, as a trusted partner, to be able to meet the customer where they're at, to understand what their risk tolerance is, what is as they progress through business continuity discussions. What are those critical pieces of data that need to be protected? What and how can we best do that? And what mechanism serves you best? Would that be offsite copies, encrypted, immutable copies? How do we then be able to validate and test? How are we scanning for vulnerabilities that may exist within a data stream? How can we then assist periodically to validate and test? We look and we bifurcate and separate the difference between data replication and backups. But how do we know that there's not a one size fits all. So it's very conversational. It's very prescriptive in our approach in how we engage our customers to understand what best fits their needs, whether that could be, whole data, backups, application aware. How do we meet the customer where they are at?
No, that's awesome, and it actually kind of leans a little bit into one of the second points we have on the slide here, which is the regulatory changes in data sovereignty. But in broad terms, you called out the fact that there is no one size fits all solution. There is no, hey, you bought this thing, you suddenly have disaster recovery, right? And as a managed service provider, we work with different verticals. We have healthcare, we have banking, we have education, public, private sector. We have so many different things going on, and so it's a disservice, in my opinion, to our clients to say, well, yeah, here's our solution, and it means you now have it. You know what I mean? Like it's not appropriate. And from my perspective, when I say it's not appropriate, I mean, like, this is a partnership, right? When I look at myself and what we do here at LightEdge and the industry, like these are all partnerships that we're building. And so it is important for me to say, hey, I'm looking out for your best interests as well. Your best interests are my best interests. And it's rough to be able to say such a thing and then show up with a kind of a one size fits all solution, right? We want to make sure we're kind of tailoring things. And so actually that kind of leads me to a couple different topics here that I want to kind of talk a little bit about. And we're going to kind of jump around a little bit, folks. So forgive me, because this had me thinking about something in particular. Talking about disaster recovery as a service, or talking about what it means to be able to work with different clients across different sectors, different requirements, et cetera. So for a number of years, Matt and I actually worked for another managed service provider that did outsource IT for school districts. And they, as I'm sure you can imagine, right, and this is something that we encountered along the way, Matt, school districts, public sector, oftentimes very shoestring budgets, right? Technology requirements are ever changing, but budgets are typically not keeping up with it. And the same thing also trickles down to some of the staffing, right? Goodness, Matt, I was one IT person at a school district. You were one that served many, so a scale thing is also part of it. But why do I bring all this up? So I bring this up because when we think about the as a service portion of the backup and the disaster recovery, you actually had a disaster, right? You absolutely had a disaster. There was a school district that lost all of their email data, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm remembering that correctly. So completely lost. And this was, correct me, Matt, actually, if you may, can you kind of walk us through that a little bit and just talk about like what kind of happened during that time?
So the entire school district, I think it was a total of 7 different schools. The entire email system went down. The Exchange database was corrupted. No good backups. One of the key things that people forget about is testing backups, especially for things like this. The backup was never tested. There was no viable restore option or anything. I want to say good 24 hours later, lots of Red Bull, some crying. we had no option. There was no restore point. We had to go through a third-party route and pay a lot of money to a private vendor to recover what email they could from a corrupted EDB file.
I mean, that's ridiculous. And again, think about the time. Well, first of all, again, when you say no choice, for anybody that works in public sector, heck, any sector at this point, but especially school districts, email is so unbelievably critical. It is arguably the most critical infrastructure in some school districts, the ability for them to kind of manage and deal with email. And so thinking about that right for a second. So 24 hours later, you had to work with a third-party vendor. It cost you a whole bunch. And if we're being fair, a lot of this, or at least potentially, could have been mitigated with some real testing, right? If we knew that backup tests was successful, if we knew X, Y, Z, J, we would be in much better shape. And again, when we talk about this whole like conversations from the field thing, like when we have conversations with clients, all of these things are in the back of our minds, right? We're always constantly churning, like not necessarily to always have an answer to like a worst case scenario or anything like that, not at all. But when we try to have conversations with clients, we want to know what they're doing, what's going on in their infrastructure, what's important to them in their business, what can't go down, what can go down. So again, we constantly have these things in the back of our head about how can this all come together and how does this make the most sense for our client. Last thing I actually want to talk about, which kind of dovetails a little bit into the DR conversation, is that geopolitical and climate events. So two key things are kind of happening in my brain right now, at least from a conversation of DR, right? Climate events, most certainly. Wildfires, hurricanes, I mean, you name your natural disaster, but there's also issues with power, just distribution and even generation, right? And when you look at certain parts of the globe and you look at even certain parts of the United States, power grid issues are fairly well known. So we're kind of in an interesting space right now where, because of this big push, this big demand into AI, we're having more and more data centers, these really dense, very power heavy data centers popping up here, there, and everywhere. And again, a lot of people are now trying to look at DR scenarios or DR events, looking at power availability. It's getting way more complicated. On top of that is some of the geopolitical stuff, thinking about like some of the pending upcoming tariffs, for example, around certain imports. And so if you're purchasing servers, if you're purchasing switching equipment, like there's, again, whatever you need for a refresh, or you're trying to refresh your DR environment, those are things you now have to consider. You now have to consider, okay, do we pull the trigger now, whether or not we have budgets in the wake of potential tariffs? Do we delay? Does that put us at risk? And actually, if I may talk about risk for a moment, this is something I like having a conversation with Thad about, is what it comes down to for us is how can we help kind of mitigate risk for our clients, right? And so when we're having these conversations of, hey, what are you trying to accomplish? Again, our whole thing is, all right, how can we make this kind of seamless and smooth for our clients? And so I'm thinking about mitigating risk, Thad, when we're talking about designing solutions around like disaster recovery or backup as a service, whatever. Can you kind of talk a little bit about like some of the thought process behind helping our clients reduce risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we, as a managed service organization, we do not want to look at this as an outsource item. We look at this as an opportunity to staff aug your organization. And what we want to do is that we bring a lot of experience, a lot of not only infrastructure experience to the table, a lot of OS and networking experience. With that being said, is that we want to integrate, and I think it's very important to integrate ourselves into the business continuity conversation. That really helps us out, helps you out to determine that level of risk, risk tolerances, data prioritization, those type of things. Because again, to Robert's point, is that we are all on a journey, and we are all in different portions of that journey. And for us, it's very important to understand that risk so we do not over-engineer. Sometimes it's very important to crawl, walk, and run. I think there's a real important statistic that would state that organizations that attempt their first test, 60% of those organizations will fail that first test. In order for us to be successful, it's not only about being able to look at your organization holistically, but be able to create planning and periodic interval steps within there for us to be successful. We want to achieve full DR recovery. In order to do that is that we have to constantly look at risk and we have to test. And we know that even after testing, we feel successful, but more than likely within 3 to 6 months, we've added change within our organization that can affect our ability to not only recover, but to achieve that full realization of DR.
That first of all, thank you. But that made me think of one thing in particular, because you called out like iterative, right? This needs to be continuous improvement, continuous change. I love that. And I can give you a specific example of that and why it's actually really important to, yes, we all want to pass. Yes, absolutely. But there's absolutely something to be gained from the failures as well. And so where am I going with this? So when I worked in a delivery, we were in the process of doing a DR test for a client, right? And so here at Light Edge, when we're implementing a disaster recovery, we like to make sure things are tested and functioning, at least based on the scope, before we hand it over, right? Anyway. So we were doing DR testing, and the client requirement was, hey, we need to have all of these systems up and online within 60 minutes. This was their specific requirement. It had been communicated to all their business, et cetera. And so the very first test that we ran, I think it took us, if I'm not mistaken, maybe just shy of an hour and a half. We ran into a couple of issues in terms of the actual underlying actually, it was a network driver for some Linux VMs that we had to fix along the way. But again, imagine a scenario, Thad, where it was very much that, right? It was like, well, you failed this test. Sorry, have a nice day. Well, that would have been a huge disservice. It would have, you know what I mean? Instead, it was an adjustment. Okay, we now know that when we have to fail over, this needs to change in this order. And that, to me, is what's great about working with Light Edge is it's a partnership, right? We want, like, our whole thing is, and you also called it out, almost like a staff hog, right? We're part of the bench, we're part of the team. And our job is to make sure we adhere to your requirements as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the big differentiators here too is that we have a dedicated team of people that bring in a considerable amount of expertise to the process. So where, I have 30 years of experience in the enterprise, and I had very similar experiences that you and Matt had. We would be hyper focused on getting past that test, signaling victory, and then immediately after that test was over, we would forget about it for another 6 months, and we were never really, I think, doing our organization the service that they needed. And I think that when we look at the products that we have here, it's holistic. It's how do we create a program? And I think that is the key, a program that you can follow, that can grow with you, but achieves long-lasting results. I don't want to just across the finish line signal victory and then forget about it for another 6 months again. I think our program is designed to not only meet you where you're at, but iterate over that. Hey, what has changed? Is this, maybe it's merely that quarterly tabletop exercise where we're evaluating the run book at a very high level and looking for mere relevancies. Yeah, nope, that server is no longer there. Or no, we've added a new SQL server that needs to be brought up before this app server is. So I think it adds that level of value, that the ability to sit down with a team and go, yeah, you're right. I didn't think of that. We need to add this in.
Right on. Right. Well, and actually that, if I may, go ahead and hit the next slide. So that actually spins a little bit into, because you talked a couple things, right? You talked about, you've already talked about iteration. You've talked about developing a program. And I think that bit of it is actually really, really important. So here's why, and this is actually kind of put all these points here together. So first, let's talk about real quick, big market changes, right? We talked about AI. We already know that is absolutely shaken the industry to its core. There's a lot of different conversations having around there. But interestingly enough, for a lot of cloud service providers, clients, et cetera, there was also the big old Broadcom changes. This is something that we're all fairly familiar with. And good, bad, and different, that's neither here nor there. But the reality is it was still a big change to the market, right? And so it actually, again, for those that attended the previous session or happened to see it, there are plenty of organizations, I think it was just over 50%, if I'm not mistaken, are considering making a change since that acquisition and since rather the license change. And so that is now having to be considered as part of building a DR strategy, right? Now I have to go, okay, well, in 1 year, I have VMware coming for renewal. I don't know if I'm going to continue the renewal, but I do have to establish a DR plan because that's a business requirement. But then how do I do that alongside of looking at other solutions and then testing DR for those solutions? There's so many things just wrapped into one license change, it seems. And this also goes back to, or this leads into the lack of readiness, right? I am a client that just got hit with a massive uptick, or I have a license term change or whatever that looks like. And now I have to make a decision of, frankly, the future of my company from a technology perspective. And then also I have to figure out how to adhere to all of my policies, adhere to data protection, test all the things. Like IT is in such a, I don't want to call it a bind necessarily, but we're in such an interesting position where we have to make very big decisions very, very quickly. And also do so with effectively no questions left unanswered, right? It's that kind of where we have to have that Herculean effort around IT in order to achieve like certain goals. And this is actually where we start leading a little bit into like the actual like DRaaS providers and where we effectively step in, right? Because if now, again, you're looking at VMware, infrastructure changes, refreshes, et cetera. We already talked about pending tariffs. So for those that are just looking at a hardware refresh rather than a platform, you have to deal with that. You have a mix of different platforms, different plans, different data points, right? And so you're having to figure out how to reconcile all of those things. And now you also have to pick a provider in the mix, right? Where do they come in? Where can we add value, right? Value is a big important part of that conversation. So Matt, if I may, actually, I had a conversation with a client recently talking about, what it is, like what availability they have on their end, capabilities, et cetera. And something that came up that, again, I think you really encounter a lot of is this statement. He said to us, I really can't afford to hire another person or two people to do this job, but I can afford to buy a solution. And so when we're having those conversations with clients about a DR provider or a backup as a service provider, how do you, I suppose, Matt, how do you have that conversation with them about like, hey, look, let's talk about value. What's important to you in terms of backup as a service or DR as a service?
Well, I think the value goes way beyond just, any kind of backup or DR platform, right? It's truly what you said, as a service. And it's to something Thad was touching on earlier, us being an extension of their team, their, kind of infrastructure, their personnel, that, we kind of have to show that value of what we can provide, how we can help outside of just providing some kind of solution of, here's a backup application or a DR application or a solution to it. It really comes into play with the run books, the assistance with the testing, the validation of backups or DR plans, disaster recoveries. Can we meet RPOs and RTOs? Back to your conversation earlier of having to reiterate that backup testing to make sure that you hit that client's needs and expectations. Sometimes there's a lot riding on that, whether it's just, company losing money or some kind of, higher stakes that could be involved, just depending on what they do or what their needs are.
And actually, so first, thanks, Matt. Because I absolutely agree. Right. Again, this is literally just us kind of going through the motions of saying, hey, look, our whole thought process rather, and philosophy is, again, meeting people where they're at and tailoring all of our solutions to their needs. And actually, you called out something in particular. It's as a service, right? And so I think a lot of times as technologists, as IT folks, engineers, whatever, we tend to get wrapped into the technology aspects, right? And not necessarily in a bad way. I love technology. I love understanding my ones and zeros, how many knobs and stuff can I turn and pull to make this what I want it to be, which is great. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, there's that darker side of that, right? There is, well, my proxy site went down, my WAN accelerator went down. I have bad permissions. I forgot to renew my wildcard certificate. Think about like all the little dumb admin-y things that kind of happen along the way when all you're trying to be focused on is backup, right? So Thad, this is something that I think is really important. And I'm going to kind of give you two things. So first, it's helping people get, forgive me, my brain I saw a message come across and I had to kind of re-get my brain here. So let's talk about for a moment, helping clients. Oh goodness gracious, my folks, I got completely turned sideways on this one. Sorry about that. So Thad, when we're talking to clients about backup as a service, and we're talking about helping clients with that admin-y stuff, right? What I kind of qualify or call like mundane as a service, right? That is so much value in and of itself, right? Being able to say, hey, look, again, regardless of the technology, the platform is going to be up, it's going to be available, your backups are going to be monitored, tested, checked. Like there's value in and of that. And I think going a step further, when we talk about the trends for like disasters, DRaaS like service providers like us, we've also made it a really good focus around the runbook services, right? I think that's also a really key thing that people maybe even overlook sometimes, right? That runbook service is really valuable.
Yeah, we cannot focus enough on it. And our focus really is, we are not creating a run book to serve light edge. We are creating a run book to serve both. Someone at the customer side and or a light edge site should be able to pick up that run book and traverse that and achieve failover and or recovery. And I think the other piece of that, the other goal here is in the understanding is that most organizations are moving away from that monolithic data center type of footprint, and their level of complexity is great. Not only do they have a footprint on-prem, they may have a data center footprint, but they're also having a hyperscale footprint. That could be Azure, that could be GCP, that could be AWS. We are looking at that holistically. How do we create successful DR planning run books around not only a particular vertical that you may trying to protect, but the whole thing. So I think it offers us a unique differentiator in the marketplace. Not only are we looking at the data center, but we're also looking at the cloud also. How do we protect that data, not only from a backup and recovery, but also a data replication? So we bring in a considerable amount of wealth and talent around those areas, as you particularly said about the VMware Broadcom. A lot of people are having to move data or reduce risk by moving data to multiple areas. So I think that is the other key piece, is how do we look at our environment holistically? How do we look at risk? How do we then create plans and recovery mechanisms around the entire ecosystem?
That's awesome. Before I dive into this slide right here, because now we're starting to get into some of the real like meat of it, insofar as like defining what disaster recovery is to backup, et cetera, and how it's coming off of your stuff, Thad. But for now, if I may, real quick pause. Any questions from anybody? I don't see anything popping up just yet, but if there are, again, please don't hesitate. I'm gonna take a quick drink of water here, real quick. Yeah, no questions coming across just yet, but I will say, to kind of, I guess, ask a question, what is the difference, right, between backup and disaster recovery, because there is most certainly a difference. And so we've kind of really super duper condensed like what it is, like at a high level, what these differences are, right? And so especially with that, when you talked about like, again, understanding the complexities of environments, I have stuff here now, I have stuff there, I have this, like, how do we look at things holistically? And again, that does start with differentiating backup and disaster recovery, and then what we're bringing to the table with disaster recovery as a service. So for example, with backup, right? The goal there with backup is just an additional copy of data, right? Whatever that looks like, wherever it lives, it could be in archive storage, it could be in cold blob storage somewhere, it could be a hot copy. There's all that matters really is a copy. Something I also want to call out is that technically speaking, data replication is backup. Right? We're taking one copy of data and moving it to another location. And so, for example, let's, for the sake of talking about technology, right? So one of the most popular applications or platforms out there for performing like disaster recovery and more specifically workload failover is Zerto. We're a Zerto partner, use it for a number of years. Zerto is great, it's really good. There was for some time some messaging that I think was a little confusing, where people just thought Zerto was DR, or that Zerto meant DR in some capacity. But if we're being fair, all it really was just another means of backup. Admittedly, some orchestration and everything in terms of being able to actually do the recovery aspects, but at its core, it was replicating data to another location. And so with that in mind, right, backup is having multiple copies of data, and the idea is very much just if we need to do some spot restores here and there, no problem, but it is primarily focused on having additional copies of data. Now, where that differs with disaster recovery is about restoration. It is not about, can I move my VM from one place to another? It is also about, can I bring it up and have it work? And actually, Matt, if I can talk to you for a moment, we encountered this so frequently. Matt and I both spent time in service delivery. We spent time, obviously, as solutions architects here. So frequently do we encounter the, I can move my VMs from one place to another, and that means I have DR, right? That's most certainly not the case. When you're having a conversation with a client who says, well, I have Veeam today, or I have Cohesity, or I have whatever, doesn't that count as DR? Like, how do you kind of handle that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of always had this conversation. You know, I'm going to be the first to shout the words from a mountaintop that backup is not DR and DR is not backup, right? Yes, they are intertwined, and to what you were saying earlier, they are almost identical and similar as far as function go. Copies of data that exist elsewhere. What it really comes down to is your retention and how fast you can recover from said retention. One of the biggest conversations that I have with clients, people about backups and DR and the difference between the two is, when's the last time your backup ran, right? It may be 24 hours ago, it may be 48 hours ago. So that's great and fine if that's your disaster recovery plan. Do you have it outlined anywhere that your recovery time is now 2 days? Potentially your data is now 2 days old, 24 hours old. Whereas, it's something that is more short-term retention, but faster as far, to like a Zerto, right? You now only have a 24-hour window to go back from, but you have those checkpoints within seconds or minutes, depending on any kind of latency. That, yes, we could restore from backups. We might be kneecapped a little bit as far as data loss, struggling to get those restores done, put things back in place. Can we restore a full image of a virtual machine or bare metal machine? Do we just have the data that we now have to rebuild and bring all that data back in through an import? Or do we have something that is more purpose built for a disaster of, massive power outage or hurricane on the way, Godzilla's coming up from the ocean, whatever it be? What do you do in that case? And if you have something that is more purpose built for DR rather than backups, we can be up within maybe 30 minutes to an hour. We have real-time checkpoints of known good data within, the past 45 seconds before we had to declare a disaster event. And now it just saves that effort of trying to go back through the data and trying to rebuild rather than just kind of shift and keep going on while you rebuild what's, down or offline at that point.
You called out so many. First of all, the Godzilla reference, I'm here for that. But also, you've centered an awful lot around the data. The data. How old's the data? How soon do you need the data? What's your tolerance for data? Especially in the grand scheme of the AI world that we're living in, right? Like, what type of data are you training your AI models on? Is it current, fresh data that you want it to be on? Is it older data? And now, as part of disaster recovery, and as part of your utilization of AI, how are you accounting for that, right? Like if you're
Right.
leveraging, again, like a chat GPT or something like that and training it on your data, but then suddenly that data needs to be restored, how does that impact your utilization of AI? How does that impact the people that then downstream use that AI for their own tasks, right? And so we now have to really kind of hone in and focus on data resiliency, data availability, and what's wrapped around that are things like backup and disaster recovery. But if I may, thinking more about the as a service side of the house, right? So Matt, you talked about a lot of different things. You talked about your tolerance for data loss. You talked about different types of technologies, right? Process is also important, right? You talked about like, hey, what is it written? How is it written? What are the tolerances, et cetera? The as a service portion of it is where we as service providers, in my opinion, shine, right? Because we have the ability to say, well, what do you need and when do you need it, right? We can say, okay, well, you need to have this particular server restored, but this is a much less restrictive RTO, RPO. We can let this one go a day, but this one has to be part of this tier, which has to be failed over in this manner. Imagine if you're just a 2 or 3 person IT shop and you have to figure out all of those things. You're gathering quotes from multiple vendors for backup platforms, disaster recovery platforms. You're trying to integrate your networking into all of that. You're trying to understand, do I need to get a firewall provider? Can I use that? There's so many questions wrapped into that, which is why we as service providers do this as a service. And Thad, you talked about it plenty. You've talked about holistic approaches. You've talked about, again, meeting clients where they're at. And this is precisely why we do DR as a service, right? We eliminate, or at minimum, reduce a lot of that headache. You just tell us what your requirements are, and we're going to figure out the pieces from there.
Robert, to that point, I think one of the most meaningful conversations around this that I've had with clients is asking those questions. Where is your data? How important is it? How fast do you need it? Do you have anything written within company guidelines to say these are required RTOs and RPOs, and get them to think about it? Because sometimes those requirements that you were just talking about, of what are your requirements, a lot of times they don't exist. They've never been thought about within a company-wide scheme of things. And now we're trying to provide that assistance to really help them think and go through their infrastructure of what is critical, what is super low time RTO or RPO, what can be covered from backups as far as a full DR plan, and kind of what's not important. And again, where is everything? With the whole hybrid cloud situation, it's pieces may be in public cloud, on-prem, and private cloud, all over the place. How do we pull all that together?
And I think to build on that is that we see that a lot of our customers are leveraging Google Workspace, Office 365, and there's always that assumption is that what is Microsoft providing me? Well, their job is to protect the underlying infrastructure, and it's important from a managed service provider to let our customers know that no, your data is still vulnerable, that we still have to address critical components of that data. If it's valuable, if it's that Exchange data, if it's that SharePoint data, if it's that Teams data, how are we protecting it? If we're assigning a value to that, what are we doing? Those conversations are extraordinarily important.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And actually, it looks like I happen to take a quick peek. We do have some questions that come in, so I'll kind of hit these real quick. So first one is a little bit of a long one, so hang on here, folks. Disaster recovery is expensive, and thorough testing is critical to ensure everything works when a real disaster hits. Is there a recognized framework or best practice that organizations can use to identify which of their crown jewels, in quotations, is truly DR worthy? And how do you decide whether you need a fully mirrored, call it apples to apples environment, versus a scaled down, call it a pilot light solution that provides minimal continuity until basically the disaster recovery has been completed? So there's a couple of different questions in there. I want to, if I may, real quick, I'll touch on a little bit and I'll pass it to you guys as well. So as far as the disaster recovery being expensive part of it, that's expensive is kind of a relative thing, not to disagree. It's just one of those things where you'd be surprised, especially as a managed service provider. Like we absolutely can provide some fairly cost-effective disaster recovery, especially for those looking at alternatives like a DIY, for example, where you're having to do a bunch of like capital investment, buying servers, rack space, et cetera. So you'd be surprised actually how cost-effective a lot of DR solutions can be, especially now. But also in terms of like, is there a recognized framework or best practice? And if I'm, from my perspective anyway, and again, you gentlemen, please feel free to chime in. From my perspective, there isn't really a single framework or best practice around that. Again, if you know, part of the conversation we've had along the way is there's no silver bullet, there's no one size fits all solution. And so from my perspective, there's no framework. Like I can't Google a disaster recovery framework and then suddenly start applying all my stuff to that. It's not. It might help me get there, but it's not 100%. From my perspective, it's more what's important to the business. What do you need to achieve to, or rather, what do you need in order to have your business come back online again? Thad, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think from what we want to do, and I can't say this enough, we want to meet you where you're at, but it's important to have honest conversations. And I have been in a lot of internal IT organizations, a lot of enterprises where everything foundationally begins at that business continuity. What if we need to start assigning a value to our data? We need to start assigning a value to our core infrastructure based upon those conversations. If I had a set of systems that are down for more than an hour, 2 hours, will that be detrimental to my organization? From there, then we can start assessing value or start assessing what is the appropriate disaster recovery mechanism that we can assign. To your point is that, I think to the person who's asking the question, is that DR should be effective for your organization. And we should be able to build cost-effective DR solutions, but it's really based upon what your risk tolerances are. How much data can you lose within your organization and still function? How can we provide tools, and how can we provide very prescriptive tools and solutions through our SAs, through our DR engineers that can make that more cost effective? Sometimes it's about spending real dollars to achieve a very low RPO. I've got to be near zero data loss, and that recovery time needs to be in minutes. All right, we're going to have to create dedicated real-time replication and dedicated resources towards that. But I also know that I have systems that have the ability to be down for a couple days. Well, again, that goes back to that one size fits all. There is none. Let's put a combination together that makes sense and then wrap that around a smart recovery runbook design. But I think everything starts with having a smart internal business continuity discussion, and we can assist with that. But really, that the only people that know that level of risk is our customer, but we can assist with that.
And when we talk about partnerships, that is precisely it, right? Again, we're an extension of the team. We are here to design solutions to fit your needs, not our needs, right? That's precisely what we're not here to do that. And you talk about business continuity. You talk about doing things that are appropriate for maintaining your business. And actually, Matt, I'm going to kick you this one. It's a little bit another question from the crowd. Matt, is the combination of backup and DRaaS enough for business continuity?
that
Boy, is that a loaded question? Yeah.
I honestly, it depends on the business. It truly does. For some cases, backups might just be perfectly fine. Some cases, disaster recovery as a service. In some places, it's a combination of both with the addition of availability. You could have a business where being down means you're now losing money because you're not processing invoices. But all you need to run that core business on a day-to-day is just having a database server up. You need one server. For that would be DRaaS. You have that instant, low latent, low RPO server back online as quickly as possible, and you just go through the manual process of keeping the money coming in for the business. Whereas sometimes, if you're a web shop, publicly facing, now you're looking at availability where instead of just relying on 2 servers in one location, let's start to diversify and go geographically different locations with, the same data sets and availability between all of them. Just if something happens in one place, we're not affected on X number of other servers that are located in different parts of the US or overseas or something. So that driver really, again, goes back to, what we were talking about one size does not fit all. For some cases, yes, backup is good enough, or DRaaS is good enough, or a combination of the two, or adding availability, but it truly comes down to business case and need.
And I think one other thing that we need to focus on, we focus a lot on data. The ability not only to iteratively back that data up through a backup method or a replication tooling. I think the other critical piece, and I think the other value that we add to this is network. And with our workforces being so distributed, the complexity of your network design cannot be discounted. And the level of complexity that we have gradually inserted into all of our networks, the ability for us to realize SD-WAN connectivity between our remote offices, the ability for IPsec or SSL VPN connectivity, those things can be very extraordinarily complicated. It has to be accounted for. I cannot say it enough. The ability for us for IP portability, we live and die by our static IP, our external static IP addresses. How do we account for that? So again, it's that holistic approach that we have to account for. Sometimes we're very hyper-focused on our data, which we should be. It's the lifeblood. But we also have to then bring that back and go, how do I access that data? Can everyone access that data in the event of a declared disaster? It's something that it's important. We stress it highly here at LightEdge.
Absolutely. And actually, so somebody had typed in the chat. And by the way, since we are coming up on time, folks, if there are any last minute questions, please don't hesitate to drop them in. But somebody had actually called out basically what you had talked about as well, Thad, right? Business continuity includes business processes beyond backup and DR, right? If a disaster, I'll actually read it verbatim. If a disaster wipes out how employees can work, where they work, access to IT systems, et cetera, business continuity introduces the ability to conduct business operations above and beyond the systems being recovered and restored, right? And so, and I agree with that absolutely, right? It's again that holistic approach, right? It can't just be about, hey, I've restored this VM, I've restored these files. It has to be about how does Jim and Tom and Pam and whomever else, how do they access that data? How does it matter that it's now old data versus fresh data? So it's much more holistic, much more broad than just, hey, I can do a thing here, there, everywhere. And if I may, it kind of summarizes itself really well here on this lovely little slide about designing a DR plan, right? Like, we've hit on these so many times throughout this conversation already, but understand what your goals are. Remember, this is important. What are your goals? Not what are LightEdge's goals. Our goals are your goals, right? So, and our job is to help facilitate those. So whatever those are, we can even work with you on establishing what those are. That's what we're here for. Also, Thad, you called this out. Embrace continuous improvement. The whole point of a run book, the whole point of this program is it's an evolving thing. It's a changing thing. Your requirements are not going to be the same 6 months from now, let alone 6 years from now. And so having a partner to work with you in that mix along the way, making those changes, keeping your run book up to date, you're going to be in a good position long term, regardless of whatever changes may come. And then lastly, it's about building a strong team. When you have disaster recovery as a service here at LightEdge, we mean it as a service. If you want to be totally involved top to bottom, absolutely. If you want to be as hands-off as possible and let LightEdge carry the bulk of it, whatever in between doesn't matter to us, right? We're part of your team. So when you say, hey, LightEdge, my IT systems are down, my ERP, my whatever is down, that means our systems are down too. And that is our job to get in there and fix it again. And I think that, to me, really summarizes, if I can be a little cliche, it kind of summarizes the state of like backup as a service, disaster recovery service, anything as a service in 2025 and beyond. It's about partnerships, making sure that you are working with partners that are trying to meet you where you're at, trying to design and tailor solutions to your needs, not just a provider that just has numbers and boxes. You know what I mean? That's the differentiator that we're bringing to the table these days. It's that holistic approach. It's that real approach. It's the, hey, I had to deal with this too, and it was the worst, and this is why we do it this way approach. It's been really great actually working with LightEdge in that regard. We do take this stuff very seriously. We are at the end of the call, folks. We're going to go ahead and, first of all, thank everybody for being here. Matt, Thad, very much appreciate your time today. If there are any more questions from the chat, feel free to reach out to your local LightEdge account exec. Feel free to email folks. I know we're sending some invites after the fact. And hey, again, thank you so much for being with us today. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But otherwise, have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.